Alright, so I'm getting back into the swing of things since I actually consider that review I did of this book lazy. So this is a much needed direct review of the book, weirdly enough, like Damage Control. I want this to be a brief but chronological, and I'm going off of the strongest bridges of the story, as well as the main players in the history. Yeah, for anyone who's, like, wondering why I haven't made a freaking video in a while, I've just been working like crazy, and I have had, like, zero energy to do anything. Pretty sure most people know that feeling. Alright, the book goes on to mention that no one nation or group is necessarily responsible for eugenics, as it manifested in the Middle East, the Americas, and the UK with the rest of Europe. Scientists and policymakers and religion were enthusiastic to unleash it for different reasons. Eventually psychology, but mostly agriculture, animal husbandry, and God's model of purity to build the nation. Race and genetics as multiple disciplines became linked based on sickness and minor difference overlapping to some people who couldn't tell the difference between a different nose shape and a deformity. Charles Darwin, as a proto-anthropologist putting the spell of evolution into the hearts of others, trickling down as survival of the fittest, coined by Richard Spencer, Herbert Spencer, not Herbert Spencer, sorry about that. National fitness was an obsession. Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, coining the word eugenics to mean well-born. The concept of eugenics founded off the lost work of botany math from Gregory Mendel. The botany and animal husbandry were the models for breeding humanity to perfection, named paroculture, related to natal health for nation strength in the vaguest sense. Around the around the 1800s and 1900s, Francis Galton saw, in his opinion, the change in British Parliament as national decay. The decay rhetoric varying by nation, the least subtle being in Nazi Germany, for example, Reich propaganda in 1936 stating a family of 5 is more profitable than one person with a hereditary disease. Meanwhile, Christianity, under the motto, quote, yes, I have a goodly heritage, end quote, gave away medals for family fitter contests. Americans, Minister Dwight Hills and John Harvey Kellogg saw eugenics as their type of religious redemption during World War I. Catholics frowned in disgust at eugenics, as did the non-elitists who saw the course of nature, though unfortunately it was seen as inevitable by some, such as Julian Huxley, a student of Francis Galton, claiming eugenics would be a part of, quote, the religion of the future, end quote, a whole new discipline called, quote, beyondism, end quote, was coined by psychologist Raymond Cattell, implanting eugenics with evolutionary theory, setting the stage for everything having an excuse to be socially engineered at a scientific level rather than mystical manifest destiny. Despite critics understandably casting it as pseudoscience, its political implications are complicated throughout history within global Varna systems that deny or privilege the starving or shiny masses. Difference and first impressions cement our bias on how others use their bodies to reproduce across the globe, for surpassing the World War II threshold for associations. Alright. The assumption of, or lack of, intelligence was basically inherent in the eugenics crusade, right from the start within Francis Galton, who by simple anecdotal observation saw intelligence standards related to family stocks. The fact that individuals had varying intel on certain topics and across time and space was fascinating to people, as it was cast as inherent and obvious to know a thing. Some eugenists saw education as a waste of time, since nature was king over nurture. People were deemed feeble-minded at a policy level via the 1920 Supreme Court, with the assumption that you were, quote, definitely mentally off because of some misplaced intuition about family heredity. Medicalized terms proposed by the, quote, Medical Association for Feeble-Minded, end quote, in 1910 were used. Idiots, imbeciles, and morons, with varying mental ages associated with the terms. Although they're not used today in a medical setting, we use the term still casually without a eugenic connection necessarily. Asylums and segregated classrooms were rampant to shelter in good faith or pure malice, since not everyone agreed with the methods around the social corner. An asylum superintendent going on to say in 1888 to the Royal Commission, quote, idiocy is formed by ill-assorted marriages, end quote, hearkening to full-on arranged relationships. The book shows a very old photo from 1800s New York of a school for crippled children, which was labeled with fine print that says, quote, feeble-minded and crippled school. Census data at the time added them as a demographic of, quote, deaf, dumb, blind, and insane, end quote. Obviously, at this point, IQ was entrenched in society with tests that went literally worldwide, with varying cultural differences in what was deemed obvious or worth knowing and common sense. It must be noted that the creator of the IQ test, Alfred Binet, was anti-determinist and used his test to uplift people instead of boxing them into mental casts that confused disease with a human. Binet and Simon worked together for it to fall awkwardly around the world. In 1920s, psychologists in the form of psychometrists had took over the Netherlands and the Americas and Russia, parts of Africa and India. By 1916, the concept of IQ was updated by Louis Terman of the American Eugenics Society, which to this day is being revised. The eugenic IQ idea invaded objectively needed knowledge. The eugenic IQ idea invaded objectively needed knowledge given only for a test like soldiers in the military and work professions. But the tests also had massive subjective power, like a specific location. A subjective area, like a specific location. Clothing, fabric, or simple taste in certain faces or things, personal preferences as a eugenic principle under the logic, along with moral judgment questions like, quote, what do you do when you break something that's not yours? Which seems obvious, maybe. Which seems fair if it didn't blur the line with other tests that were just subjective and non-moral. Race was made into a eugenic issue, along with immigration and femininity. Writing about woman intelligence in 1903, Popular Science Monthly, quote, woman departed in what was considered normal compared to men. In the same year, Helen Woolley wrote that the mental traits of sex an immediate counter that gender disparities are socially constructed issues. As the book points out, the eugenicists never cared for intelligence in terms of their role for breeding for the state, without an opinion. Intelligence lowering fertility. The book has an appropriate section called Moral Danger, as human pedigrees were used as 3/4 of those in prison were called feeble-minded. Others who took Binet tests in a specific location where inmates were almost all feeble-minded. 80% of them, actually. 80% of eugenicists. Henry Goddard followed and tracked the family history of what was called the Kallikak family, who were claiming to be inbred and likely an excuse to socially pick on them, and they're basically being used as experiments at this point, actually. I think it's implied American psychologists went to Africa to judge the masses. They claimed at the time that African intelligence dropped after puberty, lowering skill of African people in apartheid Africa during World War I. Before 1930s, the U.S. via the National Bureau of Education started mainstreaming tests. As well-known racial binary started. As the well-known racial binary started. It was mostly genetics or heredity that dictated blacks' skill. Meanwhile, if white children fail, it's environment or, quote, they didn't try hard enough. So, outside of this Western binary bias, the IQ weapon was being applied into other fortunate or unfortunate social circumstances. In Japan, Scotland, Mexico, etc. Of course, white as a category of elite status didn't restrict itself to the West as much as its colloquial understanding. As it's colloquial understood today by lore and myths by the caste, and much focus on their own country. The core intent of eugenics ideology was proper reproduction. This meant multiple nations and the states to monitor everyone's marriage. Caution in Switzerland, contracts of wellness checks in 1920s Iran to the more extreme Nazi Germany blood law. Prenatal tests make sense and generally good for info on the fetus, but first impression and class played a role in the testing landscape. Activists, seeing a pattern of tests aimed at the poor, even without the Nazi variant. Only 9 states in America allowed interracial marriage until the Supreme Court decision in 1967. Of course, the book mentions that before eugenics was conceived as a weapon of science, there was always marriage laws. Prenatal checks, as controversial as they were or are a benefit, so it's a shame there were times it was banned by activists to protect minorities, yet harming anyone who might need or want them consensually. Same goes for bans on abortion and contraceptive causing harm, usually outlawed during wartime, specifically to incentivize coercively, though less drastic measures have been made to boost the birth rate that most people agree with. There's quite a bit of example that the book runs down. 2. Argentina and Latin America was the first to introduce maternity leave in 1934. 2. Russia, Germany, etc., worldwide played around with giving money to large families. 3. In times of stress during the war, they gave cash outs to women who have more kids in 1940s. 4. As mentioned, better family contests awarded with ribbons and cash. 5. The double-edged sword of welfare state with eugenics hidden within. For example, positive eugenics, a term they use to mean the demographics they want to live, and despite this attempt to hike up the birth rate, eugenics feared it would backfire into breeding chaos, turning into a negative eugenics attack from the state. 6. Shows, events, magazines, and radios, basically all media at the time, backed eugenic rhetoric. Berlin, in 1906, hosted a child exhibit, yet, and the YMCA in China used sideshows and beyond to promote eugenics. Despite all the push and pull of the bodily autonomy on women from the state to breed, another mentions women will and always have risked their lives to have kids or abort an unwanted child. There aren't many choices to make, so healthcare should be there. But the book goes into minor detail of feminist agenda eugenists like Margaret Sanger, Mary Stroop, promoting a female cap in 1920s called pro-race. Remember, the intelligent excuse of eugenics which played its rhetorical propaganda part. Racial IQ influenced eugenic feminist causes, especially in times of segregation America. Novelists like Charlotte Gilman flat out stated, "No men are needed for the makers of the men. Oh, sorry, women are needed for the, quote, makers of men," and, quote, measureless racial importance, end quote, encapsulating racial caste and gender duty to the state. As you can maybe notice, there's contradictory elements in the eugenics mind. Women aren't meant for education unless it pertains to reproductive safety, in as much as they didn't hold off on children while the state worried about an overflow of children. The cash incentive could make or break the state into keeping people well off enough financially that they might not breed. So the balance of the social engineering was delicate. So they might not breed or they might breed, but you need an incentive somehow, because then it's not a democracy if you force it. And that's what the birth dearth, which is off topic, has pointed out, which we are actually in that state where we are no longer a democracy after it took away Roe and the right to privacy in that way. Alright. Historically, sex education has been a state or national intervention, along with abortion, contraceptive, and divorce as a weapon of the elite. Although these things have the illusion of an option when they want to prevent the option and the demographics they don't favor, it logically makes sense to promote having children during war and hard times, but unfortunately the consent varies for region. Euthanasia was praised on a massive scale in Nazi Germany by eugenist audiences. A photo taken between 1930s to 1940s shows a community of asylum buildings with words over it saying, quote, "She will be proud someday not to need asylums any longer," end quote, with a list of finances spent on government, police, and army, and lists the asylums as them. Around this time, Americans were advocating for eugenics sterilizing, even if to a lesser extent in our historical memory. A man known as Foster Kennedy called for euthanasia onto others as nature's mistake. Oof. Damn. Alright. Outside of sexism, racism, and ableism connections to birth control, the overall and general fear of the growing teeming masses has directed it towards genocidal weaponry and rhetoric. Thomas Malthus in 1800 spoke of the multiplying masses and removal of the poor, removal of the poor laws to cut down on the population or bring the poor into plagued corridors to kill them off. This was one of the many attempts not from world leaders or fascists to engineer the people. In modern times, mass murder was categorized as genocide after World War II. The Nazis we captured were tried for the crimes against humanity. In the mid-40s, by the way. This monumental step in defeating evil established the 1947 Nuremberg Code via U.S. versus Brandt court case, a moral principle not to not medically experiment on humans without their knowledge. The public, from the beginning, were skeptical, but now were aware of coercion that pushed eugenics to the underground fringe. Though society was already disproportionately placed, but nobody, for the most part, was being sterilized, or at least not openly praising it in a policy on the level of Nazi Germany. But it didn't stop after 1945. Decades later, in 1950s and 60s, planet-wide population control was growing as an idea from the book, quote, The Population Bomb, written by Paul Ulrich. Initially, the worry was divorce, birth, and education control. Now eugenics' focus was the casual expansion of antibiotics, food rationing, better nutrition, and agricultural feeding everyone, creating food waste phenomenon. Policy eventually made to lock dumpsters to prevent scavenging, to prevent the poor from eating. The new luxuries impact on population, putting fear into the elites over the developing world and the first world, thus new methods of positive and negative eugenics. 1. In the 1950s, U.S. foreign aid, scientists and heavily rich individuals helped continue to fund Planned Parenthood and Sanger's cause to remove the poor and less well-off. This isn't directly stated, but it's implied. 2. 1968, Population Council, and with the help of the Rockefeller family, funded family planning through the Walt Disney Corporation. 3. President Dwight Eisenhower made contraceptive a part of the national security. Quote, we need an effective 2-cent contraceptive. End quote. 4. At this time, the author goes on to say the scheme of the time was, quote, zero population growth, where births and deaths replaced each other. The issue of the birth dearth, actually. 5. Disney characters like Donald Duck starred in short videos to people in the third world. The Population Council goes on saying, quote, describing the motive, attitudes favorable to the small family norm. 6. Norplant contraceptive in 1991 was heavily connected to those on welfare. The rest of the world also projected population control as the key to human survival. Some attempts at the population in India and Pakistan mirror the old ways and even old language from Indian parliament. Quote, sterilize people from undesirable mental and physical issues, end quote. Leader of India in 1966 used family planning to gather 6 million IUDs, thus around 1974 to 77, 12 million people were sterilized. In 1966, Singapore was on the same path as it legalized abortion, and the two-child policy. They offered housing to people who birthed to the state. The Romanian planning taxed childless people to have kids in 1966. 1995 China, besides its one-child policy, worked a law about infant health, though it was a formal eugenic law that made sterilization and contraceptive permanent to married people. Jeez. Okay. The state and nation was under quotas and goals to achieve by arousing people bloodlessly. The quotas and goals to achieve by erasing people bloodlessly or otherwise, like India removing indigenous people in the 80s, specifically the women of Puerto, Quechua, and Aymara tribes were sterilized. Even in the age of the internet and consumerism, India in 2011 were offering cars for being sterilized. Actually, the book points out that the BBC dubbed it, quote, cars for sterilization. Alright, that's pretty spooky if you ask me. Okay. Conclusion, the book does mention that new science to detect what and who the fetus is like, such as predicting a disease and gender, would be a type of new eugenics. Engineering the biology of the fetus before they are born, mixed with genetic research, apparently called reprogenetics, or reprogramming genetics. Ironically enough, it was likely the beyondism of the 60s, of the late 60s. Obviously, for good reason. There was public pushback on this new method to heal humanity. Ever since 1969, criticism was halted modern methods, as Robert Scheinheimer, a molecular biologist, noted, was still an ethical dilemma that remained in new eugenics. The new technology of amniocentesis spread in the 1960s. The detection of severely chronic illnesses could be approached in a way that didn't remove the human from the gene pool, as bigotry has overlapped difference with disease in the past, and actual debilitating illnesses seen as separate from the person being medically targeted. Although societal bigotry has pushed certain people with illnesses into defense against any good faith healing, as lifestyles defined by certain issues someone has. Fear of the medical establishment is understandable fear in old eugenic attitudes. Although there was still abortions to prevent rather debilitating issues, especially with the invention of the ultrasound to guide the amniocentic needle. In 1972, by the way, at the time, the top diseases being treated were PKU and sickle cell anemia. Although there weren't lifestyles to these illnesses, there were still assumptions about how much of the population had the disease, and obviously the lack of information and bias, first impression, etc., was a cause for concern, because the information and bias in 1972 National Sickle Cell Anemia Control had fudged their numbers on how many had the disease, claiming 2 million Americans had sickle cell when it was only 100,000, which the book points out caused medical screening in schools being fired from military and insurance companies raising prices for those afflicted. Just to mention, the fudge numbers meant unneeded abortion probably took place under the medical establishment. Whether it was an honest mistake or not, negligence was still rampant with genetic testing, but it made abortion slowly obsolete. In the 1990s, sex-based disparities with the pre-implantation genetic diagnoses allowed parents to choose the sex of the child, which caused it to be banned in India due to female infanticide. The author ends the book with two final things, a positive note and another not so much. She points out that states and countries have taken minor responsibility, as Switzerland apologized in the 1980s for the genocide of the Yenish people by taking away their children. Reparations from Sweden in 1996 were given to those whose lives they ruined. And in the early 2000s, some U.S. states apologized for their sterilization programs, the old victims of eugenics having their time to tell their story. But the worry never strayed. Sociologist Dorothy Wirtz ran a survey in 1998 on ethical and medical malpractice, finding that genetic testing was purposefully slanted and, quote, was leading to openly directed advice, end quote. The new fear that genetic counseling becomes more common to the populace, that the genetic path will be the new directed and new rigid paradigm. The more positive ending is the thought of consumer eugenics and whether or not it's possible on a non-coercive eugenic method is possible at all. As mentioned before, and it seems like the only example I could think of consumer eugenics at this point is its sterilization for objects like cars. Alright, that's it for now. You should read this book, guys. Alright, peace.